Hi, everyone, and welcome to this AWS presentation covering Babelfish for PostgreSQL. I'm going to give you an introduction to Babelfish, what it is, and how to get started, how to also check if your app today is a good fit for Babelfish. So what is Babelfish? Babelfish is the easiest and fastest way to migrate from SQL Server to Amazon Aurora. Babelfish lets Amazon Aurora understand the SQL Server dialect, which means both T-SQL and other language semantics. So keep in mind that not only will Babelfish work for Amazon Aurora, but as I'll discuss later, you can set up Babelfish to work on other Postgres engines. It's very, very easy to get started with Babelfish, as you see here. Once you select a supported version of Aurora, simply click the Turn on Babelfish checkbox. Of course, you can configure more advanced settings, but that's enough just to get started.
So before we go further, there could be some people on the call who've already seen Babelfish and wanted to just let them know about what's new in version 1.1.0 in Babelfish. We've definitely added a lot of things that customers have asked and enhanced support. You can see the full list here in terms of our release notes, and I recommend check back regularly. If you're seeing this, especially as a recording later, then odds are good that we could have yet a new version of Babelfish if you're watching this in 6 months, which could have a lot more added to it. So if you want to take a look, there's definitely some things like the square function. We allowed more functionality inside of triggers and so forth. And again, you're free to browse through a lot of these enhancements. I created a very, very basic demo just showing some of the new items that we added. So here you can, for example, see that now we support a create trigger after, and I'm just going to execute this and you'll see all this great stuff. Now, for those who are new to Babelfish, I just want to take this moment because I know that some of the people on the call may have already tried it and they want to see what's new. I'm now going to switch back and we're going to dive in to Babelfish. Remember, Babelfish is actually open source. So again, you're free to actually take a look at the code yourself. You can run it on, on premises or however you'd like, and you can stay up to date also with what our developers are doing by just keeping track of the project. All right, so now I'm going to switch back to the main presentation.
First, very briefly, why would you want to migrate from SQL Server to Amazon Aurora using Babelfish? There are many reasons. It's costly, you have proprietary technology, and of course there's a lot of licensing issues that you're probably going to hit. What is Babelfish in a nutshell? Well, Babelfish in a nutshell is another port that is opened, another way to connect and communicate with the Aurora database. As you can see here from the diagram, not only do you have the port 5432, which is the default Postgres endpoint, but with Babelfish, you have a new port, 1433, the default TDS endpoint, which understands the SQL Server dialect. And this means that you don't need to change your drivers, and you can natively understand the SQL dialect. It's not a translation layer. It's not something that just understands the dialect itself, but it actually goes all the way to the point where you can simply connect your apps directly to the Aurora engine. Of course, these are the default ports. You may have different ports set up for yourself or for your organization. A very important principle of Babelfish is the principle of correctness. And this is very important. There's other ways to migrate, but often, they have some limitations. With Babelfish, we really push the envelope to make sure that whatever you get in SQL Server is what you're going to get when you use Babelfish. Babelfish will either return the correct result as it would be if ran on SQL Server, or it will return an error. So for example, this is just one example of many. In Babelfish, there's a new data type because in SQL Server, the money data type has 4 digits of precision. However, in Postgres, the money data type only has 2 digits of precision. So in Babelfish, we actually created a new data type through an extension, and this allows you to have 4-digit precision, and therefore you can keep that precision and make sure that you have correct results. Because obviously, if you're doing a large sum or roll-up, you're going to have different results if you don't have a high enough precision. Another one is just the semantics. So we go very, very deep into the engine to make sure that you're going to get the same results if you're running on Babelfish or SQL Server. Again, if you end up hitting something in the SQL Server dialect, which Babelfish doesn't support, it will return an error, but otherwise it will give you the correct results. So in this case, this is an example where SQL Server keeps a transaction open and rolls back only the statement causing the error, which means that if you look at this, values 1 and 2 are actually going to be inside your table. What we're doing on line 4 over here is we're setting all of the column values to 3. And of course, that will cause a duplicate key insert because there's a unique constraint. However, SQL Server keeps both of these values in the table. Now, if we did that in Postgres, suppose we just used some sort of other migration mechanism, then you'll see that Postgres returns 0 rows. Why is that? Because Postgres rolls back the whole transaction. However, in Babelfish, assuming you connect to the TDS port, the one that understands the SQL Server dialect, then you will get the same behavior. You will get the behavior here where you actually get 2 results. So this is just one example where we're not just having a simple one-to-one matching of, hey, let's approximate the behavior, but we're actually making sure that everything, including transactional semantics on that TDS port, are going to behave the same. I'll go through another example here. This is a case where, again, you're doing some inserts and you're going to get a duplicate key insert. And what's going to happen here is you're basically going to, after their subsequent statements are still going to be executed. It's going to continue executing even though an error was raised, right? And in Postgres, the default action is actually going to be that an error handler is evoked, and then the rest of your code is not executed. So once again, in Babelfish, when you go through the TDS port, we're going to use the SQL Server behavior to make sure that you get correct answers, and that you won't have the trouble of always worrying about these little details, which once you go into production, make a very big difference in terms of your ability to migrate. And this is the goal. You can keep existing queries as they are, run the T-SQL. You can accelerate your migrations, and of course, you're free to innovate. In fact, with Babelfish, you can connect the same app to both ports. You can have one connection object going to the PostgreSQL port and another connection object going to the Postgres port. So you have one on the SQL Server port, the other one on the Postgres port, and you can do an insert on one port and then read it from the other port. Worth mentioning that you should be careful when you do things like transactions across ports. Simple reading and writing is very, very easy to do, but as you saw from the last slides, the transactional semantics in SQL Server and Postgres are very, very different. So we advise that while you can definitely use both ports, be wary when you're doing transactions, because you could have behavior that you don't expect if you're reading from one port and then executing it in another, or if you're doing if a trigger is involved, etc. So just keep that in mind. You can definitely connect to both ports, but there are caveats, and the rule of thumb is try to avoid transactions that are going to be using code written in both engines. So another interesting about Babelfish, which is good to know, is that there is no lock-in. It's open. It's an open source project. It's available on GitHub. In essence, Babelfish is essentially a collection of Postgres extensions. And this makes it very easy for you to run. Even if you don't want AWS, you're free to use it in a dev test environment or even on other clouds. So again, with Babelfish, you have no compromises on correctness. It makes it very easy to run the SQL Server dialect on Babelfish on an Aurora engine or Postgres engine. You have a wire-compatible protocol, which means you can connect. It supports the .NET framework and so forth. And you have interoperability, where you can connect to both ports at once. And so in terms of a future development model, many people ask, well, wait a minute, can I run Babelfish forever? Is it a temporary thing? To be clear, many people, likely the majority, are going to be running Babelfish forever, because it's hard to convince an organization, if code is working and it's ported to Babelfish, convincing your organization to migrate every single line of code. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We expect most people will be running Babelfish forever, especially for larger apps. Many people will use it as a transition or just migrate at their own pace. Maybe initially most of your code is in T-SQL, and then as time goes on, you can transition that to PostgreSQL. So you have that choice. You can either develop new functionality in T-SQL and continue using the skills of your team and SQL Server database drivers, or you can develop new functionality in Postgres, right? It's really up to you with Babelfish, and you can migrate at your own pace. So how do you migrate? What's the migration path? The easiest is to simply export your DDL. At this point, by the way, you're just doing a check. You're going to run an assessment tool to find incompatibilities. So you don't even have to launch a Babelfish instance. There's no cost whatsoever. Simply run an assessment tool to find any incompatibilities. We have an assessment tool, 2 options for assessment tools, which we'll talk about. And then export the DDL, run your assessment tool. It's a very simple command line tool, just one line that will generate a report in HTML. Import, then make minor adjustments to DDL. Babelfish doesn't support some exotic parts of the SQL Server engine, for example, XML. If you use things related to the SQL Server agent, or if you have certain other parts of the code, everything is documented in our AWS docs in terms of what is not supported. And you may need to do sort of some refactoring on that DDL to make sure that it works with Babelfish. All the things that you have to do will be found in the assessment tool, which we'll talk about in that report. And then you just import your adjusted DDL to Babelfish. There's no SCT conversion needed. Again, it just supports the native SQL Server DDL once it's adjusted to allow for Babelfish support. And then afterwards, you import data, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And in sum, the short answer to that is today, the best way to do that is using SSIS. And just a hint there, when you do import data, of course, you can use SSIS and import a lot. You can also just create a smaller data set to start testing the app. So let's talk about the different options for migration assessment tools. There's two options, and there's a recommended option. The recommended option is a tool called Babelfish Compass. This is an open source tool. It was crafted specifically for Babelfish. It's also updated very, very regularly because it's on GitHub, and it's a community project. For those who are at the webinar, you can download this presentation with the links. There's also a user guide, and it provides a very detailed and up-to-date assessment report. It also has certain other capabilities, such as the ability to also create recommendations for things such as a merge statement, which aren't supported for Babelfish at this time. The other option is to use SCT's assessment feature for Babelfish assessment. This is a really simple way to get started because you may have SCT installed already. You might already have a fleet with SCT. And in this case, SCT will run a basic assessment, and you can use that as well. Overall, we currently recommend option one, and this is because it's going to be more up-to-date. It's a community tool. It's constantly getting new updates. And even though both of these tools share the same assessment logic file, in fact, you're going to get a slightly more up-to-date version of that assessment tool when you choose option one, which is the Babelfish Compass tool. Now at this point, you have an HTML report from Compass, which gives you an idea of how much you might need to change to use Babelfish. And again, your mileage will very much vary at this point. You may run it on your app and find that there's just a lot of XML and things that today, as a today's statement, as of early 2022, that Babelfish doesn't support, although we're always adding more and more to the Babelfish engine. Or you may find that you're just about ready to go, and there's only a few minor tweaks to your DDL, if any, and now it's time to start bringing in data. So as of today, the best way to import data is actually the SSIS tool. While this is a tool that we don't officially support, it's a tool that works with the SQL Server protocol, and of course we support TDS, and thus this is going to be a great option for you. The one thing to remember when you're using SSIS is to turn off the bulk insert when possible option here at the bottom of the screen. Just disable bulk insert. As of today, Babelfish does not support bulk insert. There is a blog which I'll click very, very quickly just so you can get some context on what a migration would require. Great. As you can see here, there's very, very simple step-by-step instructions to get started and create a data flow task. Even for those of you who may be helping a client to migrate or are using SSIS for the first time, it really starts at the beginning and will take you through the steps and some of the caveats to make sure that you do migrate. So, all right. So coming back to the presentation. So this again is the best practice at this time in terms of moving data to Babelfish. As time goes on, there'll be a lot of other exciting options that will be available for Babelfish, but this is a current great way to move lots of data today, especially if you have very large tables and so forth. So now we're going to go on to what Babelfish supports more broadly. Babelfish supports quite a lot of the SQL Server dialect: triggers and stored procedures, nested transactions, table valued functions. Our data types there's many custom data types to make sure that precision is maintained, save points and static cursors, and a lot more. In fact, more and more is being added all the time. As you can see, as time went on, for those who saw the preview, they saw a lot of really interesting things being added, from case-insensitive identifiers, better collation support, output clause support, and so forth. So, all right, so potential blockers. Here's a list of things that are definitely items to keep in mind when you decide whether or not Babelfish is a good fit for your app. So use of in database encryption, for example. We expect that you likely use the native Aurora encryption methodologies. Items such as geospatial and column store, that sort of thing, those are sort of more related to the SQL Server ecosystem. The goal of Babelfish is to very much focus on the core engines. So support for items that rely on SQL Server agents or column store or geospatial, that's not going to be supported in Babelfish. There are some limited use cases available that you can use for SSRS, SSIS, as you've seen, but definitely before you move a complicated app, you want to make sure that that is all aligned and that you're basically going to be able to get the core items that you need running also to run when it's on Babelfish, or consider migrating those reports and so forth to a Postgres ecosystem. One big thing is XML support. While there is some XML support in Babelfish, certainly that's something that you want to watch out for, and all that will be caught in the Compass tool to determine whether or not your XML will be supported. And items like bulk insert today are not supported in Babelfish. For more details, you can visit the documentation. There's a full list, if you click that link, of all the items that Babelfish doesn't support. Of course, whatever isn't in that list is supported, which is a tremendous amount, as I've shown on previous slides. In terms of support for development tools, there is limited support for SSMS. I'm going to show you very quickly how to connect to Babelfish with SSMS. There's also, of course, SQL CMD support. Other tools may or may not be supported. I'd suggest that you give them a try and see how far you can get with Babelfish. It really depends on how much those tools are calling, various different stored procedures inside Babelfish, because many of those will be supported, but others are not yet supported. So I'm going to show you just super briefly how you can connect to Babelfish with SSMS. One important thing here is SSMS often wants you to connect by default to via the Object Explorer, but keep in mind that for the current version of Babelfish available today, you have to connect to the query editor. So I'm just going to click Cancel, and then I'm going to click New Query. And now we see the exact same looking Connect to Server window, but this will work. I just click Connect. And there you go. Now I'm connected and I can create a new query. And you should see the list of databases here as well. There we go. So, and that's how you get started. And then you can just query with SSMS. So again, it's pretty easy to get started. You can basically use a lot of the tools that you're already accustomed to using. Now, a great way to get started with Babelfish is to set up an onboarding session with an AWS Babelfish Specialist Solutions Architect team member. This is because they'll allow a bit of a deep dive on your specific apps, the parts of your app which you may have questions about in terms of whether or not Babelfish will be a good fit. And on top of that, you'll be able to get a very custom tailored setup process for your tools, right? You may need certain tools set up which you use to access your database, and the specialist SA team has a lot of familiarity, both with common connection tools, SSRS, SSIS. So this team is going to accelerate your journey using Babelfish over to Aurora Postgres. And another thing that's very important to mention is the immersion day, which should be available by the time that this webinar is published. So this is a great resource in terms of training broader teams. So certainly take a look at Immersion Day materials. Once this link is publicly available, I will be adding it to this presentation. And if not, reach out to your Amazon AWS representative to obtain that link.
All right, great. So now as this next step, I'm going to show how to deploy Babelfish. I'm going to go through a basic deployment and then also running the Compass tool. Now, I want to just say before I get started, I'm going to jump into the meat here, and we're going to create a Babelfish cluster, but you don't even need to create one in order to get started with Compass. Compass is actually its own independent tool. It's a very, very simple download. It's just very basic Java program that will scan any DDL. So before I jump into this, I'm going to do this in more of a logical order and get started with Babelfish. But keep in mind, you can just get your database DDL, export it using SSMS, and then install Compass without even having to deploy Babelfish. Now I'm going to go through the process. I'm just going to deploy Babelfish, then we'll run Compass, just to show you how to run Compass and the report. And then finally, I'm just going to connect to show you how to get basic connectivity to Babelfish. So again, we just go to the Create New Database wizard, and we're going to choose Postgres Compatible Edition. Make sure that you choose the very latest version of Postgres. That will get you the most up-to-date version of Babelfish with all the goodies inside it. Definitely later than 13.4, but I'd recommend choosing whatever the latest version is that you have here. For simplicity, I'm going to choose dev test. That will just make my configuration option easier. And let's call this database-my webinar. All right. And here I'm going to put a password. And finally, I'm going to choose a slightly bigger instance, mainly so we can deploy faster and take a quicker look. And here's the real magic. I'm going to scroll down and see there's just an option here, turn on Babelfish. Now, what this does in the background when you click this means basically we're creating, setting up our parameter groups properly and creating a default set parameter group that will work well with Babelfish. Of course, if you're using a command line tool, then you can do this yourself using the command line, but this just makes it dead simple to get started and to give Babelfish a kick in the tires. Now, I want to go back up here and enable public access. I'm going to choose a VPC. And choosing a VPC here, this is basically just to ensure that you choose a VPC that will give your IP address access to Babelfish. So if you're trying to connect from a desktop client tool like I'm about to show you, for example, using SSMS, do make sure that your security groups are configured appropriately. You should make sure that you allow access to both the TDS port and the Postgres port, which is pretty easy inside your security group settings there. Finally, one thing I'm going to do, which is sometimes a tip depending on whether you have limited access to your AWS account, I'm just going to take off performance insights for now. You may not have access to even access that data, and it just saves a bit of usage, but that's totally optional. And that's it. Again, it's just a few clicks, and then we're going to create our database, and our instance will be launched and created. So then you should see this screen where your instance is then being created. And what I'm going to do actually is, rather than waiting for this instance to be created because it'll take a few moments, I'm going to actually now just jump into SSMS and show a different one that I created earlier today, webinar 1, so you don't have to wait. But this is going to be essentially the same experience, right? So we're going to click this instance here, which I set up earlier today just as a quick demo. And as you can see, there's two endpoint names here. Remember to choose the writer instance, especially, I know some people who may be watching this are new to SQL Server or maybe new to AWS. Make sure that you select the writer instance as where you want to go, right? And now we're going to open up SSMS. In fact, I'm going to show you exactly how to do this with SSMS. I'm going to close SMS and I'm going to show you a quick tip using Babelfish. So let's just give SSMS a moment to load. Again, this is the tool that any SQL Server DBA or power user would be familiar with. It's the default tool to connect to SQL Server, and we're going to show you how to connect with Babelfish. Okay, so we load SSMS. We're actually going to click cancel. The reason is that SSMS by default prompts us to connect using the Object Explorer. Today, Babelfish doesn't support the Object Explorer. It only supports the query editor. So then do you see how I click New Query right there? I'm going to click that, and now I can just enter my server name. So I'm just going to, just to emphasize this, I just took this server name here, going to copy and paste. Okay. Your default username is, generally assuming you chose the default in the previous screen, is going to be Postgres. And your password is whatever password that you chose. I'm just going to put that password right in here, and then we're going to connect. And bam. There we go, we're now connected. And as you can see, you are now connected via SSMS to Babelfish, right? And next, I'm just gonna go here. I actually created a database for some of our work, and I'm just gonna show a super basic example here. I'm gonna post in it's kind of like a very basic app for a bike store. We've got some interesting tables here, with products and customers and so forth. This is the DDL, and I'm just going to show how we can run that right on Babelfish, and then you're going to see it right there. So that completed successfully, right? And now what I'm going to do, though, now that did happen to work very, very well on Babelfish. But you may ask yourself, well, I heard that there's some things that Babelfish does not support at this time. What about that? Well, this is where we start using the compass tool to easily find those things. Now, if you didn't have something that was supported in Babelfish, then this would fail. It would give an error. So the first thing that many people do after they've got their DDL ready and they're ready to move to Babelfish is they run it through the compass tool to determine what might not be supported in their schema. So I'm going to give a very basic demo of that, of compass now. And as you can see, I have compass here. Now I'm going to show you where to get compass. And really, if you just search Babelfish compass, then you can go to our open source GitHub page, which is where compass is available. Just scroll down here, and then you'll see here, download the executable version. And then you can download it. It's just a zip file. When you unzip that, you'll just need any version of Java. There's nothing fancy. Any version of Java will do. And then you can just run it. For me, I generally run it here. It doesn't matter if you use CMD. And basically, it's a very simple command line. You just run Babelfish compass, in this case .sh. Name your report, because again, Babelfish compass actually does do quite a lot in terms of just managing your report. If you run it multiple times and so forth, and then specify your DDL. In this case, it's the bike store objects.sql. I'm going to show you that here. This is our DDL here that we're running it on, right? Just pretty basic DDL for now. And then I use this -replace flag. That just means that, if you run multiple reports, then you're just going to replace your report. I hit that. And now Compass does its thing. It's analyzing. And in fact, as you can see, it's just so simple. It brought up the report in my browser. And while you didn't see this in another screen, it actually also opened up just the source folder of where that report is located, right? So I can access it in, right, like the file right here as needed. So again, now you have a very, very detailed report of everything that Compass has analyzed. The number, you can even analyze it with other command line parameters. You can analyze multiple DDLs at once and so forth. The number of lines processed, and here you see all the issues that you might want to review manually. There's some things that are, of course, not supported in Babelfish. There's some things that require a manual review, and you'll have all of these very clearly stated to you. And it also will show basically of a lot more just general statistics about what it's found. Now, luckily, in this case, we didn't find any issues, so our DDL is ready to import. And as you can see, we were able to successfully import it into SSMS without issues. Now, what about data? Again, let's put in that data file so we can run some queries. Let's go here. Just going to be opening up that data file. And here we have all the data that we're going to just insert. So I'm going to copy and paste this. Just put it right into a query window. Then we're going to execute. Now, this will take a little bit of time just as it sends all that data over. So again, this is Babelfish. Even though we are connecting to Babelfish, we're just using SQL Server tools with SQL Server syntax and setting up our database. And I'm just going to give this time for this query to finish running. It's inserting quite a lot of data. And once we're done, we can query it just like any other SQL Server. And of course, keep in mind that there are some things that Babelfish does not support at this time, and you can see all that documented online. For example, while there is some XML support, if your app is heavily dependent on XML, you should definitely check out the differences list on the AWS docs. which shows what is supported and what is not supported. And this will let you get started. So again, the key is to run the Compass tool to get a really handy report of what your app may need in terms of refactoring, and then just get started with Babelfish. And as you can see, we've loaded all this great data in, and we've successfully imported that. So now if we just say, let's find one of our tables, and we're just going to say select star from say products. One moment. Let's take a look at our DDL and see what we had from production.products. There we go. And there we go. As you can see, we now have a great output, and now you're running Babelfish just like that. So if you have more questions, then contact your Amazon representative. Again, it's so simple to try Babelfish and give it a quick kick in the tires. We recommend that you look at the docs, and the docs clearly list any differences that you should be aware of when you try out Babelfish. And now we're going to switch back to the rest of the presentation.
And that's it. We're going to wrap up this webinar now. I hope that this was very valuable for you, and we're going to start to take some questions.